So this is going to be the first lecture video for this course, and I'm going to put them out every Friday by 5, hopefully earlier, but by 5 o'clock to give myself a deadline. And I'm not quite sure how long they're going to be, so we'll see. So because this is kind of an experiment, right? Like everything we do right now is an experiment, and I think that's helpful, right? Because it already was an experiment before, before the pandemic. Things were already experimental, but we often didn't call it that because it was just normal everyday life. But I think since the conditions are so thrown up in the air right now, that we're able to see like the seams of the clothing of everyday life and the way that those seams are constructed, but also the way those seams are really a myth. So it's a production of a myth. And the seams, such as they are, that hold the things together, right? Ourselves, our relationships, society. The seams are in flux. And that's going to be something that we're really thinking about a lot this time together that we have. So if things are in flux, then that puts a different responsibility on us than if we're engaging the world and concepts and people and things that are fundamentally already constructed permanently. Because like this table that this computer is resting on is constructed, right? It's firm enough to hold the computer and to hold different things that you can't see right now, but right, it's constructed. But it's also in flux as it's existing in relation to myself and the actions I take. Hypothetically, I could fill it with enough things that the desk would break, right? Or I could take a hammer to the desk and the desk would break. So these relationships between things that seem stable are really in flux. And so that's going to be a major part of the work that we do. So that said, the reading for this week is a couple of excerpts from two French philosophers, Gilles Deleuze. One of them is with Felix Guattari too, his writing partner, as well as a section from Jacques Derrida. Now, these are very difficult thinkers and people, and so I want to acknowledge that right off the bat. And I think that I don't want to go too far into it right now, but we can talk about this, of course. But I'm going to put that on the table for now and just say that they're, we don't need to think about who they are or their larger philosophies right now, although we can, see some indications, I think, from this reading that we did. So, so I want to acknowledge briefly that there's a why looming maybe for you all, and I don't want to answer the why, not because I have an answer, right? I have a response, and I want to connect that to a word that I used before, which was responsibility, right? And we don't think of responsibility in terms of, right, that first part of response. And Toni Morrison talks about, right, response ability, right? The power to respond, right? And the power to speak. And so I'm not going to answer these questions, right, about why we're reading this. And that's not because I won't respond to that question. It's because I fundamentally am opposed to the idea of the traditional way that we think about answers as resolving things, right? Let's think about that together as we move through this. Why don't we want to resolve things or answer questions or problems? And why might that be unrealistic or coercing a situation? We'll put a pin in that. These are just things to think about. So I want to acknowledge that this should be a question of why that we ask. You know, why is the instructor, right, assigning this? Why does anything happen, right, in the world? And that question of why pushes us beyond, right, simplicity. It pushes us into what, but it pushes us beyond what. Because what is a permanence that is a fiction, largely, if we conceive of what's as permanent and stable. But when we think about whys, we want to think about how, when, and where. And what kind of questions are those? Those are questions of environment and context. And that's critical in how we think about whys. So, because these questions are really related to how we think about thinking. And this question breaks up into how we've been taught to think about thinking. And I want to unpack that and think about that. And these are all topics. Anything I say, and beyond that, right, you can use as a trampoline to jump off into your own thoughts. But beyond that, we've been taught to, thinking about thinking is really thinking about how we've been taught to think about thinking, which I would offer is usually not at all. And that's why we're gonna put the uptake function so centrally in this course. And that's why we're going to be working on process over product. We're going to make things that we traditionally recognize as products, sure. But the grade or the real work is in not evaluation or assessment, right? Those words might be things that we used to call that. But uptake is more about thinking about how we're engaging the ideas before us, which calls into play our antecedent experience and knowledge, right? Our previous experience and knowledge, and how the previous experience, right, which composes us, engaged with the new experience of learning these materials. So the learning is in the uptake, right? It's in seeing how we resisted or accepted the ideas, and how there was pushback or provocation or new things emerging unexpectedly from the material, right? And really thinking about how we learn. So in this class, right, it's clear that we're going to be thinking about thinking, as well as language and writing, as modes of thinking. And in the Thursday Zoom, we talked about mode a little bit, and we're going to talk about mode a lot, right? What is a mode? And I think of mode just simply, right? Because there's a phrase people use a lot, multimodal, right? Multimodal composition. And that's usually in opposition to like a quote unquote single mode composition, right? Which would be alphabetic text, right? Or just like an essay or a piece of writing. Whereas multimodal is a good example might be a meme, right? Because those involve pictures and words and potentially sound, right? Or touch in terms of like the illusions of the meme itself, right? So mode simply, I take to be a type or a kind, a way of appearing. So those are things to think about, right? Like a way of appearing. And those things can be oral, right, sonic, or visual, tactile, these sort of things. And we'll talk more about that. Okay, so I do want to foreground some questions that I posted in ReggieNet for Thursday. Sorry, for Tuesday. And as we've talked about, these classes are going to be broken up into, and this is provisional, but this is how I kind of see it going. And we're going to talk about this as the class goes, right? But it's going to be kind of explanatory on Tuesdays, or summative, I call it, or maybe conclusive. But I like explanatory because it's gonna put us in the position of thinking about whatever the material for the week is in the context of what that person is presenting the material as. So it will call us to think about what their intentions are and what they're doing concretely in that work. And so it's going to be more about what's familiar to us. And so we're going to begin the process, right, of engaging that material and what they're doing, and also navigate it, right, through our antecedent experience, our antecedent knowledge, right, of the different things that they're bringing up. Because even in the most complicated, hard to understand things, there's still stuff we can hold on to, right, stuff we can grab onto and say, oh, that's recognizable. And that's why I chose these writings for the first class. They're very difficult. I'm not going to bullshit you. And it's helping us to engage with messy, difficult situations and to give up that control, while also asserting a new kind of control, a control of finding what's familiar, and then maybe being provoked and saying, whoa, that's familiar, but also this is being used in a very distinct way that's in opposition to the way that I previously understood this. And then Thursdays are going to be more problematic. And there could be some overlap, of course, depending on the material. But Thursdays are going to be more like the problematizing. And if that word is unfamiliar to you, then that's okay, right? It's a word that basically I take to mean making a problem out of something, right? So I believe it's fundamental to this because it's putting the thing into flux. It's taking something concrete and putting it into flux. And that usually means connecting it to other things in the world. So that's the basic structure of the class. Now, these writings deal with the nature of thought, language, and writing. Our goal, first off, is to try to understand what it is they're saying. As these excerpts come from larger works, there's some context that will not be given. And even if you read the whole work, it probably would, it would still be difficult. I recommend reading through the material and not getting hung up on what you don't know. But instead, seek out units of recognizable words, phrases, concepts despite the fact that they may be used in confusing, non-traditional ways. So, I'm going to try to identify some potential areas like that in these texts, while also zooming in on specific sections to unpack the meaning, right, such as I think it is. And so, okay. On that note, let me pull out these notes. Okay. Hope you all still with me. All right. So, the first excerpt was from Deleuze and Guattari, and it's a little section from 1,000 Plateaus, their book, which I have right over here. Don't need to show it to you, but it's a fun book. Okay, so the section that I selected to begin from, right off the bat, I think presents right why I selected it potentially. Language is made not to be believed, but to be obeyed, and to compel obedience. Does this jive with what you think language does, right? How does this mix with your previous experience? And if we were in a class, right, I'd open this up for discussion, of course. And that's why I hope you come on Tuesday to the Zoom, so we can talk about these things. But language is made not to be believed. That beginning of the sentence right there presents the idea that our traditional notion is that language is made to be believed. What does that mean? What does it mean to make something in order to be believed? Okay. And that's a word, right, that he's using in it's a familiar word, but it's in an unfamiliar context. And it follows it by saying, language is made not to be believed, but to be obeyed. Okay? And to compel obedience. So, if we were to draw something, we have me, you, we have language over here, and language is acting on me to force obedience. Obedience to whom? Right? Obedience to what is the question. And so, right off the bat, we're presented with a couple different ideas that are traditional and familiar, I would imagine. Language, belief, obedience, the practice of something being compelled or forced. So, Deleuze and Guattari go on to say very shortly afterwards, we see this compelling of obedience in police or government announcements, which often have little plausibility or truthfulness, but say very clearly what should be observed and retained. Okay. So he's calling on something that we are, we are familiar with. We receive and read police and government announcements all the time, depending on our level of engagement in politics. But I think most of us are engaged with them, especially if we think about government announcements in a loose sense, or a more general sense. Not specifically like government officials speaking, but right in terms of stop signs or laws that are on the books, right? Like, it's not like when we're walking around, we see all the indicators for a law where it's applicable. There's some sort of abstraction. But I wanted to also give an example of this obedience, potentially, in government announcements through an example that's happening in Chicago right now, which is where I just moved from. And to think about as speech acts, the mayor essentially closing downtown Chicago down in response to the anti-racist movement that is fighting to defund the police, and the looting that occurred, right? And so that has involved, under the guise of safety and protection of property, the raising of bridges to keep out most people from the loop. And I think we see something very feudal there, right? Something very, an old practice, right? Something lords used to do hundreds of years ago to keep out, the peasants when they were rebelling. They would raise the drawbridges, and that's why they had moats. But we see something else happening in conjunction with that, in that mayoral announcement. Side by side with the closing of the loop, we saw the restrictions on the Red Line, which is the train that goes from the south side to the north side. And Mayor Lightfoot shut it down, or restricted the movement on it, right? And that reinforces already established segregation in what is one of the most segregated cities in the country and in the world. So we see how a simple thing, where the mayor says, we're trying to stop looting, reinforces the very reasons of exclusion that are giving rise to the looting and to the movement. And they are trying to not only protect the buildings, right, which seems to be the clear object of those announcements, but they are also trying to compel obedience on behalf of the larger movement that they are trying to break the spirit of. And so we see that the impact goes beyond just the simple expression that seems to be said. Like, they're saying clearly that they're protecting buildings from looting. But they're also saying a whole mess of other things about what they value, who they value, and also what and how we can engage in politics. And they're trying to compel us via exclusion and via violence to be obedient. Okay, so that's an example. That's one of many, but that's an example that I was thinking of. So right after that paragraph, Deleuze and Guattari talk about, they say words are not tools, but we give children... Oops, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. Oh, that's why I jumped ahead. I'm sorry. So the next point I want to jump to is this section. Words are not tools, but we give children language, pens, and notebooks, as we give workers shovels and pickaxes. Okay. So again, we have a clear statement with a lot of recognizable words, familiar words, and familiar relationships. right? Like at the end of the sentence, we could zoom in and say the relationship between a worker and a shovel or pickaxe. And then we could think about other workers and their equivalents of shovels and pickaxes. As a writer, as a teacher, my mouse. This is a shovel or pickaxe, right? My keyboard. All sorts of things, right? We have different shovels and pickaxes. And so, but if we go back to the beginning of the sentence, words are not tools. Okay. So again, we see him starting off by saying this very recognizable thing is not this other thing, right? Words are not tools, just like language is made not to be believed. So something else we should think about is that rhetorical effect of starting off by saying blank is not blank, right? And so in this case, words are not tools. Do we think of words as tools conventionally? How do we think of words, right? What is the function of words? What do they do for us? But we give children language, pens and notebooks, as we give workers shovels and pickaxes, okay? So there's some familiar things there to pull out and think about with our own experience, but then to juxtapose next to what Deleuze and Guattari are presenting. So they're saying they're not tools. And we give them the language, pens, and notebooks like we give workers shovels and pickaxes. Okay, all right. Then he says, a rule of grammar is a power marker before it is a syntactical marker. All right, okay. Tough sentence. A rule of grammar is a power marker before it is a syntactical marker. Now, for the Thursday operation or Thursday assignment, this could be a good sentence to think about, right, in terms of unfamiliar phrases. Power marker, syntactical marker. What's a marker? We might have an idea of what power is, and we might have an idea of what syntax is, but what is a power marker, and what is a syntactical marker, and what could it possibly mean for the power marker to appear before the syntactical marker? Rule of grammar. Familiar, maybe not. We could probably identify some rules of grammar, right? Subject-verb agreement is a good one to think about. And there's many of them that we could list off. And then we get a very tough sequence that I'm not going to necessarily break down, but I would love to see folks deal with the example that he uses. Like this sentence is tough. Information is only the strict minimum necessary for the emission, transmission, and observation of orders as commands. Tough. One must be just informed enough not to confuse fire with for. Okay, that's more recognizable. Or to avoid the unfortunate situation of the teacher and the student as described by Lewis Carroll. Now, I wonder how you guys read this. It seems to engage the telephone cliche, right? Okay. And I wonder if there's any different wrinkles here. We're going to put a pin in that, right? Is it the straight up telephone cliche, or is there something different happening? Or is it just funny or strange to see it described, right? So academically. Okay, we're going to put a pin in that for a second. Then we have another fun sentence that might be, that might be something to grasp onto and see how it provokes you. Language is not life. It gives life orders. Life does not speak. It listens and waits. Do we think about language as life? Language gives life orders. What's the difference between giving a life order, right? If we have life over here and then language as the intermediary by which orders are given, why is that not a tool? Something to think about. It listens and waits. Life does not speak. Life listens and waits. So who speaks then? So that's the end of that excerpt. And we have a whole bunch of words and phrases there that could be unpacked right at the end too. Language, life orders, right? That's a fun phrase that is recognizable. Life and order. What does it mean together? Speech, listening, waiting. Okay. So then looking at the second excerpt, which is from an essay about the filmmaker Godard, but we don't need to know that, right? We can read this and still get something from it. And that's something to think about too, right? We don't need to know everything about the thing in order for it to be useful for us and powerful for us, to make meaning with. So he presents the idea that language is presented to us, traditionally, as basically informative, an exchange, right, between things or people, or systems and people. And then Deleuze problematizes it by saying, it's doubtful whether the schoolmistress, explaining how something works or teaching spelling, is transmitting information. She's instructing. She's really delivering precepts. And children are supplied with syntax like workers being given tools. All right, okay. In order to produce utterances conforming to accepted meanings. We should take him quite literally when Godard says children are political prisoners. Language is a system of instructions rather than a means of conveying information. All right. So, he invokes the school mistress, school teacher, right? The relationship between school teacher and student again. And this time he says a common sense idea, convention, right? And we can evaluate if this is a convention of transmitting information. Is that the convention that we think about in terms of the teacher-student relationship, right? The teacher has the information and the student is there to receive the information. And maybe we even think that the teacher is there to explain how something works. But I think Deleuze is arguing here that no matter what, she's delivering precepts. What are precepts? The thing to look up, potentially, for Thursday. And then this connects to the previous reading, when he says children are supplied with syntax like workers being given tools. Okay. So this calls into play that words and language is not a tool, right? He said that before. It's not a tool. But that we're supplied with that relationship of syntax as though it was a tool. And that we're given these tools so that we can produce utterances or speech, right, or responses that can fit within a pre-designed, a pre-constructed definition or box of meaning, right? And then he says, children are political prisoners. Children are political prisoners. Language is a system of instructions rather than a means of conveying information. Okay? So, again, we have a lot more phrases that we could investigate and think about as familiar. Right? Political prisoners. Children are political prisoners. What? So when my parents teach me language, I am a political prisoner being given instructions. They're not just giving me information about the world, about how to cross the street, about what color the sky is. So the next paragraph. Tough one. I'm going to skip the first couple sentences, right? I'm going to skip the first 6 or 7 sentences. And start where he says, but we should actually start with redundancy as the transmission and relaying of orders or instructions. Redundancy. Would we also potentially call this repetition? Is there a difference between repetition and redundancy? And these are fun sentences here. I'm not going to necessarily unpack them right now, but I want to, hopefully folks will engage them. And when he says, there's information, always the minimum needed for the satisfactory reception of orders. So don't give you too much. Just enough. What's that relationship between just enough information and obedience and too much information and what's beyond obedience, right? What's an escape from obedience? Talks about silence, stammering, screaming, something slipping through, right? When something gets outside of that pre-designed box of meaning. Letting language slip through and making itself heard in spite of everything. And are these the distortions that Deleuze alludes to in the telephone example previously, right? Where he says, a teacher at the top of the stairs asks a question that is passed on by servants, who distort it each step of the way, and the student below in the courtyard returns an answer that is also distorted at each stage of the trip back. Now, what do we traditionally think about when we think about the reasons why telephone exists, right? Are we just speaking to the natural, like, it's very naturalized, right? We're not thinking about why the differences happen, right? Because they're differences, right? The teacher said one thing, and then each different person makes it different in some way, right? Or distorts it, as Deleuze says. And potentially, it seems like these distortions are subversive. It's language slipping through and making itself heard in spite of everything. This next part is very, very potentially powerful. The next 2 paragraphs. Or sorry, the next couple paragraphs. This next section is powerful too. To talk, even about yourself, is always to take the place of someone else in whose place you're claiming to speak, and who's been denied the right to speak. Have we been denied the right to speak? Have you been denied the right to speak? Even when we're speaking? How can that happen? How can I be speaking and also be denied the right to speak? And what does it mean to try to take up your own voice and see and think about that it's someone, that I'm taking the place of someone else in whose place I'm claiming to speak? These are tough ideas. I don't know. Okay. Now, but this final section of that excerpt with Deleuze, this is the major work of the course. How can we manage to speak without giving orders, without claiming to represent something or someone? How can we get people without the right to speak? And how can we restore to sounds their part in the struggle against power? That's the big ask. If language is a set of instructions, if language gives orders, am I giving you orders this whole time? Or have I been speaking in distortions in order to convey some things that language has compelled in me to make uncommunicable? How do I try to communicate those things that the language I've been taught in, and that we've been taught in, that we speak in, always wants to hide and keep me from speaking? It's a tough question. So that was the Deleuze and Guattari, those two sections. And I'm going to end with that final kind of section from Derrida. And he's even tougher. But I think this is a helpful excerpt. We'll find out. He starts off this little selection that I chose by quoting Merleau-Ponty, talking about literature and communication. And what I dig about it is that it really brings into play the inflexity, the influxness, the liveness, right? The still in developmentness of what communication does, right? When I'm speaking to you, I'm not giving you a prepackaged thing. It's in movement. In fact, I'm mobilizing it by speaking it to you, or attempting to mobilize it. So he quotes Merleau-Ponty by saying, communication arouses meanings in the mind through enticement. All right. Some fun words there. What does that incite in you? Communication, arousal, meaning. Why do we always think about arousal as sexual and only sexual, right? What is arousal? I tend to think about it as something like mobilization. And if we're sending something into movement, what does that mean about before it was in movement? The writer's thought does not control their language from without. The writer is themselves a kind of new idiom, constructing itself. My own words take me by surprise and teach me what I think. My own words surprise me and teach me what I think. Why is that, right? Like, shouldn't I understand what I've said? But he's saying before that the writer's thought does not control his language, their language from without. So that means that I am not external to my language, or my thinking is not external to my language. They're inextricably linked, right? And that's why my own words can take me by surprise. And so that I can speak something and then think to myself, what does that mean? Rather than before I speak something, say, what does this mean? And then speak it. When was a time that your own words took you by surprise and taught you what you think? A thing to think about. Then Derrida writes, it is because writing is inaugural. Inaugural. What does that mean? Right? We're familiar with the phrase inauguration, right? Or the inaugural opening, right? We think about it as an opening, right? Or beginning, starting. Writing is inaugural that is dangerous and anguishing. It does not know where it is going, and cannot be kept from the essential precipitation toward the meaning that it constitutes and that is its future. So it simultaneously is the thing that it will become, right? But it's different. It's not the thing that it will become. Kind of breaks the mind to think about, right? Like, I am what I will become, even though those things are structurally, integrally different. And how is that related to the danger or anguish of writing being a firstness? Is all writing inaugural, right? What does that mean? What does that say about writing, and what does that say about inaugural? There is no insurance against the risk of writing. And I ended with this because I want us to think about this. There's no insurance against the risk. Writing is an initial and graceless recourse. This is messy. It's going to be messy. And this is perfect for us right now in the pandemic because this is messy. This is not ideal. It's fucked up. And we're here. And we're going to do this work together. And I don't want to hide from the messiness of writing under any conditions. But it's even messier now. And given the fact that we're here, I want us to think about what we want to do. And also I want us to push against the conventions of how we traditionally understand writing, thinking, and language. And so this is the first sort of lecture on the material. And this is, I hope, been not informative, but provocative. And I hope I've also hit some of the kind of questions that I asked, or that I did ask, and will ask for Tuesday and Thursday. And again, I kind of want to end on just saying, like, there is a difference between different kinds of clarity, right? And there's clarity that makes things inert and untouchable, right, and finished. That's not the clarity we're going for. And so I want to help us. I want to talk about clarity if I've been unclear. But what I try to do is present things that are fundamentally confused in the clearest possible way. That's really the work. And so we can keep doing that work. And please, in your comments and questions and emails and posts, let's think about that. What is clarity? And when we feel clear about something, are we done with it? What do we do with clarity? Okay. So, thanks a lot, and I look forward to talking about all these things with y'all. And as a reminder, there's going to be a Zoom on Tuesdays from now on, every Tuesday, 8 a.m. And it's not mandatory, although I really do encourage y'all to come for many reasons, to talk through these ideas, as well as just connect with folks. All right, a lot of folks are going to be in their first semester in college, and we're in a pandemic. So let's try to create a community here as much as we can, because wherever we go, we make the classroom. Just because we're not in a physical structure together doesn't mean that we can't make a classroom wherever we are. And I don't want a classroom to be thought of as a sort of jail, right, or a prison. I want us to break out of that and escape that mentality. And I think we can do that by thinking about how we make a classroom whenever we're together, and how we can make sites of learning whenever we're together. So, good luck, and hope you have a nice weekend, and I look forward to hearing from y'all soon.